Good afternoon, good evening to everyone, to all the ISP members and associates on this call. So I think this has been a while since I talked to ISP community. It was a few years ago. So it's my pleasure again to be part of this, and thanks to ISP affiliate Singapore to host this. So without further ado, we'll get started. So what are we going to talk about? So first of all, I'd like to mention that, let's keep it interactive. If you have any questions, I'm sure you guys are familiar with the format, content, and how to ask questions. Let's keep it interactive. Any comments, feedbacks, very welcome. Having said that, let's jump into the agenda. So we're talking about change management. Of course, we are all from the pharma world, so we know what change management is, but still, again, what exactly are we talking about here and what's its important? And we will talk about change management through various life cycle stages of the facility. That's the crux of the conversation. And by that, what I mean is starting from inception, design, construction, and commissioning and qualification and validation stages. And then, of course, the GMP operation, continuous verification and improvement. I won't touch on much of those because those are well known, and mostly we're going to touch upon the more of upfront or front end stages, which are not very well defined, I would say. Then what are some of the industry guidances on these topics, and whether they are sufficient, what best practices are out there. Before best practices, I'll definitely highlight some of the common misconceptions in the industry. I'm sure you have your own experiences with some of the misconceptions, and then again, suggested best practices, how to, overcome those gaps in misconceptions. So that's what we're going to talk about. I think as far as the presentation, as Sanjay mentioned, we have about 30-35 minutes for the presentation, and we want to leave sufficient time for Q&A and interaction. So let's get moving with this. So change management. I'm sure you all have heard of change management because in our world, it's an extremely important topic. And as we say, it's at the heart of QMS and PQS. What is QMS? QMS is nothing but quality management system or pharmaceutical quality system. Of course, I would presume it's very well understood by everybody in this audience. It's a regulatory requirement. It's not something nice to have or good business practice. It's first and foremost, it's a regulatory requirement, right, in a GMP operations. And then just a few examples here. 21 CFR 211.100 talks about it. EU GMP talks about it. ICHQ 10 dedicated to QMS talks about it. Just a snip here on the left-hand side, you can refresh yourself. 211.100, exactly what does it talk about? Written procedures and deviations. So things have to be done per written procedures, basically, per expectations from regulatory. And then the snip below is from ICHQ 10, where you see one of the core PQS elements of his change management system. So again, let me clarify, we're not going to talk much of these because these are very well defined, and I'm sure all of you are trained on these in one way or other, maybe formally trained, informally trained. So what we're going to talk about, the things which are somewhat fluid, not very well defined, not very well described in the guidance documents, right? That's what we're going to focus on. But I just wanted to set the stage of what change management is. So we're going to talk about change management as part of the overall facility lifecycle. Again, from that, we mean right from the design, even before design stages, during the build or construction stage, verify/qualify, and slightly beyond that. And then I'm also going to touch upon where you will find some good practices mentioned in the guidance documents. Of course, in some of our favorite ISP documents, we're going to talk about that also. So our crux of the conversation is this blue, or rather pink highlighted section, what you see in the screen. But this is just setting the stage, the overall importance of change management. Now, change management is described in a few places. Before I get into this, I guess maybe we don't have a poll here, so I'll maybe not ask that way, but maybe I'm asking a question you can answer yourself. But where have you seen some definition of change management? Which practice is this? guide it is in ISPE. So let me jump into that. Further, I'm sure most of you may have seen called a good practice guide, which explains this code engineering practices. And relatively recently, a couple of years ago, there was a second edition out there. This entire guide evolves around so-called good engineering practices. And in part of that, it talks about change management and some of the things that I'm going to talk about. So it's there. This is one of the reference documents, a good document published by ISPE, available to all of us as members. So what's the ISPE definition? So for ISPE definition, the good engineering practice, it's defined, in my opinion, under rather limited purview of C&Q. So you will see in the GEP document and change management guidance and all, it mostly talks in the context of commissioning and qualification, quality risk management, and PQS. And the other point I'd like to make is, by nature, see, all these documents that you see published by ISP, great documents, right? They are all consensus documents. They cater to wide audience. So therefore, what you will see is some of the nuances you may not see. For example, in your own company, how you operate things, you will, of course, have been exposed to a lot more details, and everybody has different experiences. But of course, the nature of the documents are such that not every topic can be described in great length of detail. So from that perspective, in my opinion, yeah, GEP has a rather narrow definition within the purview of C&Q. And why is that? So what are some of the gaps? So once we go through this, you will realize that this lacks some of the focus on the more upfront things like design and specify, what are some of the best operating practices, etc., and how some of the more general aspects of covering whole process integration and technology and automation and reliability and sustainability. How are all those covered as part of GEP, and a subset of that is change management? So you will see references of CM and GEP, but in a rather wider generic sense and in a narrow definition. So again, this is where today we'll focus on what these gaps are and misconceptions are, etc. So let me spend a few minutes on facility life cycle, and we'll talk about the inception part, design, and build. Even before a facility is created, right? There's a business case. There's a business case, there's a technical need, all of those come together. There's a process which has been developed. All this gives rise to a facility before that. So there's a stage called defining the needs. Now, some of those definitions are covered under so-called URS, under quality plans, etc. And then I'm sure all of you have at least heard of all these life cycle phases, but today we'll talk about them in a slightly different perspective. So no matter what size of a facility project you have, whether you have an entire greenfield facility or you're talking about a part of the facility, let's say upgrading something as simple as, let me talk about maybe adding a few valves and automating a process, or maybe slightly more complex, adding an entire unit operation, or adding bioreactor or a WFI system or a purification system. Or as I said, the other extreme is building an entire facility. In all these facility projects in part of life cycle, in spirit, there are always some concept design, some basic design, some detailed design phases. But of course, when the projects are smaller, they're not necessarily segregated that way, but they're maybe lumped together. But there are elements of conceptual design. As I said, in my simplest example, you may have a manual process and you want to automate that. So you'll think of installing some valves, how to integrate them with automation system, which valve opens when, etc. There's still some conceptual thinking in that. So there is a stage which happens here. Then, of course, there's the basis of design or basic design stage where things like more detailed layouts, P&IDs, etc. are developed. And then there's something called detail engineering, where all the details, process, mechanical, instrumentation, automation, etc., are further developed up to so-called IFC. Now, you may call this something else, but it's nothing but issued for construction. So this stage is plan, design, specify, and some assessments also. Assessments in the sense that during this stage, Usually, you also do things like system level impact assessments or GXP assessments to figure out this project or these change entails what C&Q. All good, nothing very new in here, but maybe for those of you who have not gone through projects, it may give a little bit more insights. But so what are we talking about here? The last stage is, of course, the build and configure. We're still not reached GMP yet. We're still talking about the building of the facility in that life cycle stage. And of course, these dash lines, and I don't know how visible they are on your screen, but each of these stages or gates are pretty well defined, depending on the type of the project, depending on your company engineering practices, etc. But nevertheless, there are well-defined gates which go through from one to another. At this point, as I said, quote unquote, there is a release for construction. So whether the construction is happening on site, whether your vendor is building a system in a fabrication shop, but this is where it happens. And this, again, this pink shaded area is what I want to focus on. So part of change management and good engineering practices, how they impact these stages of the process and what some of the common gaps are. So just wanted to highlight these are some fairly common, well understood life cycle phases or stages, and they're where some of the common gaps are. And we'll talk about some of these gaps in examples and detail them out. Again, just walking quickly through remaining stages of facility life cycle so that the subsequent slides make more sense. Remember, the earlier slide ended with build arrow. Now we have something called mechanical completion. Now, you may have a slightly different definition. Some people call it physical completion, some people call it mechanical completion. But nevertheless, there's a distinct milestone when so-called project ends up to mechanical completion. And then you get into project C&Q stage. Again, it depends on small project, large project, entire facility, but invariably, there is some commissioning, and I'm quoting here, with an engineering focus. You want to make sure things work, basically. The next phase is qualification verification, which is more of a quality focus, right? So your quality folks will make sure that this is done in a certain way, it's documented in a certain way based on your company procedures. Oftentimes, of course, we leverage from commissioning to qualification, and you don't need to necessarily repeat that. Once the systems are qualified, you validate the processes. So it could be your PVs, PPQs, cleaning validation, etc. So this is the validate stage, and this is the GMP lifecycle stage. Again, when we talk about different stages, very well defined, and we're going to focus on, from an engineering focus perspective, we're going to talk about commissioning and what some of the common gaps are. So just pause maybe a few seconds here. So I hope the life cycle stages are well understood. Company to company, they're defined slightly differently. But now what we'll talk about is where the gaps are, so-called gaps are, from a change management perspective, and why it's important for us to understand what these gaps are, what do we do about those gaps, and what are some of the best practices out there. Okay, so let's move on. So, okay, we call it the V model of C&Q. Again, ask yourself, where have you seen this first? Of course, it's mentioned many places, hundreds of references, thousands of references. But I guess you will see an early reference again in one of our friendly ISPE guide, the original C&Q baseline guide, which came in 2001. What does it talk about? Very simply, on the left side, I call it the design development. Remember, we talked about the life cycle stage of design. So impact assessment, implementation is nothing but build. On the right side is qualification. So we're not going to talk about C&Q. What we're talking about, change management that happens from left to implementation to the right sides. So again, this is the focus areas. And by the way, old guide, right? It didn't necessarily talk about commissioning. It didn't necessarily talk about quality risk management, the way some of the new ISP guides are. Some of the common gaps and change management related gaps, etc., are in this area, right? I mean, we'll talk about this in more detail. In my opinion, there is no clear delineation between requirements and design, for example, and companies often do this differently, sometimes inefficiently, maybe because of there are different systems maybe being put in place. Companies have maybe their internal practices are still under development, whatever the case may be. The design development part, effective commissioning of the system. And I'll give you an actual example of a monoclonal antibody facility. Now, some of you may have a biopharma background, so you will connect with these very easily, but I'll make it simple to understand. So even if you don't have a biopharma background, let's say come from an API background or fill finish injectables background, you'll still relate to these examples. This is a more modern view of the V model. We call it a V model, right? Where is this mentioned? Of course, it's in the new version of the C&Q guide. It came out in 2019. So this is no longer a V-shaped. Of course, it covers a lot of elements, inputs to C&Q, defining requirements, design and specify, verify, release, and then continuous improvement. Again, if you see here, if you ask me, my first comment when this came out to ISP was, okay, this is not necessarily inputs to C&Q, right? If you ask me, these inputs are needed way before you start the project, even way before you start conceptual design. So you need to know your product control strategy, CPPs, CQAs, the organizational expectations and procedures, safety, health and environmental, business, operational automation. All these need to be defined way before than C&Q. So again, these are the areas in pink shaded we're going to talk about. Critical thinking, some new buzzwords. So ISP has realized some of the gaps, and we'll talk about some of these new buzzwords entering into the lexicon of ISP. You'll see some of these in the more recent CAM5 revision that came out as well. So this is a different view. Now let's get into the heart of this, right? So what are some of the common misconception, gaps, etc., which happen when the change management part is not managed very well in the upfront parts of the facility design, right? So you will see a common theme in the next few slides. On the left-hand side, I've tried to put down what some of the common misconceptions / gaps / pitfalls are, and the right-hand side, we try to put what some of the best practices are there, whether they're explicitly mentioned in some guidances or not, but they are proven ways of mitigating some of these issues. Okay, so we are talking about early stages of facility, right? Design has not started yet, let alone construction. So what happens first? You get URSs basically, right? So you have a cross-functional team who is very familiar with the processes, very familiar with the facility, very familiar with the overall requirements. They are tasked to put together these URSs. Now, what we have seen is there's a tendency to put a lot of details in URS. In other words, we'll simply call it the bloated URS, right? So people tend to put some design details in there because they think, oh my God, this is something that must be in there. But as a good practice, it's very important to realize, to differentiate between what the requirements are, true requirements are, versus what the design elements are. And oftentimes there's a not so well-defined solid line. So it's easy to cross that line. Now, what happens if you do add some of the design details, right? Is it necessarily wrong? I wouldn't say it's wrong, but certainly it's inefficient. Lock and constrain the design, which is supposed to happen once the URSs are written. And then in the later stages of design development, when functional specifications or design specs or drawings are developed, right, it will handicap the subsequent procedures, how they are developed. So URSs develop after design. Sometimes you've even seen that some people think URSs don't serve a purpose, except maybe it's a necessary evil, I guess, if I say so, to do your C&Q. That's not the case. They serve a very important purpose, of course, right? So we've also seen sometimes people keep the URSs in a draft stage, but only finalize when they're ready to do C&Q. Many times I've seen it is done because, it's not very convenient, I guess, to do change management once the URSs are approved, once the design is developed. Maybe the change management process is very onerous, very cumbersome, it's difficult, time-consuming. So as the team who is tasked to write URSs or tasked to do design, we always, of course, tend to do something which is path of least resistance, right? So from that perspective, oftentimes you see these things, either it's too bloated or you see not getting finalized, right? So what are some of the best practices? As I say, keep the URSs lean, differentiate between the true requirements from first and foremost, GMP, quality, safety, operational. And this is not the place to put your design ideas, which comes later. So if these are lean, the design development, you can also call it change management part of the design development becomes much more smoother. You get the best things integrated into design, it's done in the most efficient way. So as the design develops, right, as these specifications come on board, they will start adding some of these details through a proper quote unquote change management or project change management process. Moving forward, so URSs are written. Now we're talking about the design stages. So again, here, what are some of the common misconceptions, gaps that we see in our industry, right? Oftentimes we see a tendency not to approve the drawings, issue the drawings. Why? Because we're waiting for some inputs, because the adjacent areas are not fully developed. Those may be good reasons, but not always the case. So when the change management systems are properly defined at a project stage, and this is, remember, way up before the quality change control kicks in. So this is more in the engineering space, right? This is not in the quality quote unquote QA space yet. If this is defined well, then people should not be worried about change management. But as soon as the requirements of that particular stage are fulfilled, you can finalize the document, get it signed off, issue it. Now, when you say issue it, it could be issued for design at this stage. In the subsequent stages, it will be issued for construction. But whatever the stage may be, it needs to be issued and finalized. And then, of course, you can always change things as the design develops, if the requirements change a bit, as you learn more, let's say, from your suppliers and vendors, etc. Other common misconception we see is premature quality change control. I've seen examples where during the design development itself, let's say URSs are signed off, some part of design is done, and people talk about QCC, which is quality change control. This is very premature, and invariably it makes the project cumbersome and difficult. We don't want that. Something very different. Design qualification as a means to capture the detailed design as opposed to verified design. There's a nuance here, right? DQ was intended to qualify the design. Of course, that's a definition. In practice, what we have seen, especially with vendors and suppliers who don't have very robust quality system, is they sometimes use DQ to document the design itself. And we don't want that. The design needs to be documented in the design documents, not in the DQ. And then lastly, on this side, on a larger manufacturing facility, invariably you have to define system boundaries, whether the system boundaries are for C&Q or later for your plant operation, but you need to define those. We have seen in larger plants, there's a tendency to define system boundaries as package boundary. What that means is there may be components outside the package boundary. When I say package boundary, this is what you buy from an OEM vendor. So give a simple example. If you're buying a purified water system or a water for injection system, the generation system, of course, may be a package system from one of the well-known, renowned, reputable vendors. But then there are things outside of that, most importantly, storage and distribution system. So storage and distribution is nothing but a storage tank, supply pumps, there's a long, often long distribution loop with a bunch of valves and instrumentation. It's very important how these package boundaries are defined so that nothing is left out outside the system boundaries. Not only, of course, that never happens because once you go through qualification, things are invariably caught up into proper systems. But oftentimes what I've seen, the gap is that the boundaries are not well defined, not very logical. And that leads to complications later on. So, for example, something may not belong to a certain system, it's defined in that system. So the system is not complete because that particular component has not arrived. Or during qualification or commissioning qualification, that system component is not ready or malfunctioning, but now instead of some other package or boundary, it's part of this boundary. So these are some of the common things. So again, suggested best practices. Cannot emphasize this enough, but you need a project change management SOP. I'm sure you all have heard of it somewhere, but maybe after this session, maybe you can go through in your individual company organization what sort of change management SOP is out there, and then maybe see whether it covers a lot of these nuances to manage those changes. Oftentimes, you will see that there's always room for improvement, meaning upgrading that project change management procedure. Extremely important. As the design is being developed, right, it's important to communicate the design to all the stakeholders, internal stakeholders within your companies. If you've hired an external engineering consulting firm, for example, people like somebody like us, or your vendors or contractors. Why? Because as the design is being developed, invariably everybody is adding on to their own, within their own scope of things, they're adding and further developing design. So everybody will have to have some change management. So for example, from a preliminary drawing, they'll have next version of drawings. From preliminary specification, they'll have more detailed specification. But all of this is possible if you have a proper communication channel. And that's where things like document management system helps, right? I'm sure you've heard of this. I'm sure you have some version of DMS in your respective organization. I mentioned DQ should verify the design, not document the design. And then the best place to capture the system boundaries are on P&IDs, of course, but then it has to be done very logically so that the change management becomes easier. If you see in this one of these baseline guide, C&Q baseline guide 2019, you'll see some description of change management. Now, this entire thing is change management. And as I said before, our focus is on more on the left-hand side and not on the QCC. But I highly encourage all of you on the call to refer to at least two ISPE guidance documents. One is the C&Q baseline guide, and another one is this ISPE Good Engineering Practice Guide. You will see some good references of change management in there. And I'm sure you'll also appreciate some of the details and specificity that's missing out there, because these are consensus documents. So moving on, I don't want to take up much time. In interest of time, we have maybe 5 or 10 minutes left. But design thinking, I'm sure you must have heard this term, what design thinking is, but during the design phase, basically there's a lot of integration that has to happen, especially in larger facilities, life cycle of the facilities, right? And some change management during the process integration. So what we have seen, some of the common misconceptions is, you may have a reputable vendor for your core process unit operation, but when you again integrate the whole process, you will see gaps in between, gaps which have become difficult to manage later on, and the change management piece of that also becomes very inefficient. Again, these are a bit detailed, and I'll go through this in an overview, but what we mean here is this is the crux of the design and change management, where the individual pieces need to fit with each other, how the whole process flows through this vendor package systems in an integrated way. So this is where there's a lot of expertise that goes in there, a lot of due diligence that goes in there, and you really need a cross-functional team working together, making sure developing design, making right changes during the design stages to make sure ultimately you have a facility which is well thought out and well designed. If it's not done, of course, will lead to either inefficiencies, or in worst cases, you may have some failures, GMP deviations, some out of limit specifications, and then of course, even moving forward, sometimes if this is not done properly, even if you have failures, it's difficult to investigate failures. So again, some of the best practices are how to manage the so-called changes in design development during concept to the subsequent stages, how to integrate the process between the different vendor packages so that the later GMP operations is very efficient. So now let me give again some examples what we're talking about here, right? So let's talk about as I said, a monoclonal antibody plant. Now, what is monoclonal antibody? This is derived from mammalian cell cultures usually. And when we say large scale refers to a bioreactor, just to give some context. So when you're doing initial life cycle stages of these kind of facility, even before reaching concept design, before it becomes a project, usually the company has a business case. So for example, a need for a certain map molecule. What is the process? What's the platform process? What's the expandability? How much capacity? How do you make this future proof? All of that is usually pretty well thought out even before the project is initiated. But then at the concept design stage, many things are considered, and each one of these things are challenged, expanded, further developed, and changed from concept to basic design. So optimum number of bioreactors, right, to optimize overall plant throughput. Batch frequency. Batch frequency means nothing but in how many days one batch comes out. Now, remember, this is part of concept design, not something which happens earlier, because to do this, you need a very thorough process model, which is part of concept design. So when the project is initiated, of course, the decision is already made, whether it's a 5,000 liter bioreactor or 10,000 liter reactor. In other words, the scale is already defined. Yes, process is more or less defined, but more often than not, the number of bioreactors, yes, there is an intention of numbers, but it can only be confirmed once you have detailed process model. So how many bioreactors? How do you make the whole process very flexible and modular? So for example, if you want to make the facility efficient for multi-product operations or make it suitable for future expandability, you need to design your purification in such a way that you can add a purification step, you can skip a purification step. So a lot of those deliberations happen during concept stage. Now, is all of that 100% defined? No, absolutely not. And that's why I keep emphasizing that the initial idea is a business case, let's say to make a few hundred kgs of map, certain process in mind, certain titer in mind, etc. But then as you go through concept design, these things start taking shape from those nascent points, of course, within certain limits, within certain budget. Then comes all these other common resources, solution preps, autoclaves, EIP systems, overall integration, and striking the right balance between single-use and multi-use systems, for example, a harmonized process with defined cleaning sanitization paths as applicable, and then expandability. So many things happen here. The point here is when the concept is being developed, right? You think there won't be any changes? Of course, there will be changes. I mean, you can give many examples in doing projects across the globe, US, Europe, some in Singapore, where, just to give an example, during concept stage, you may have decided that you need X number of buffer board bags or buffer board tanks. Once you do further modeling or during the duration of the project itself, there is more knowledge of the process, or your process development team or R&D team comes up with a newer process with a different buffer scheme, right? So how do you manage all of that, right? So it's important that the first principles are documented. You really have a team who understands all of these from an integration perspective, and change management steps are followed. So change management during concept design, again, focus on core concepts and non-negotiables. So for example, I gave in this example, right? Bioreactor scale is usually non-negotiable. So let's say your company may say, you know what, it's a 10,000 liter bioreactor. I don't think that's going to change for this facility at least. Those are non-negotiable. Then you may say it's a fed batch process, or it's a process intensification, or let's say a perfusion process, for example. Some of those are non-negotiables, core concepts, but then everything else evolves as the project evolves. Not only that, but there should also be room left to manage changes after the facility is designed, after it is built, because I mean, if you see the speed of change, right? I mean, if you see speed of change in the more modern map facilities compared to, let's say, 20 years ago, they're highly flexible from a process flow perspective, automation perspective, managing different titers, managing number of unit operations. integration of single-use, multi-use, the clean room environment, CNC versus let's say grade D or grade C. So you need to keep that in mind, and therefore a need for proper change management. Again, continuing on this thought process of basis of design through detail engineering, and I don't want to go through this detail, but as you can envision, you have designed all of these things now. It's time to put things in action, creating physical things, automating the things that are created. So there are again a set of deliverables, right? Drawings, functional specs, all of that come into being, and then things are actually built, programmed, installed on site. Those are the stages. But again, planning and change management extremely critical. These things are beyond the facility build. Again, we saw some examples of where things are either not designed properly, not integrated properly. What can happen? Again, what can happen is, as I said, in more benign cases, simpler cases, simply inefficient facility, right? Yeah, you will have a good product, no questions on the quality, but your cost of goods may be higher, your turnaround time may be higher. You may have more frequent, let's say, requalifications because the way the boundaries are defined, way the acceptance criteria are defined for validation. And then we also see, of course, OPEC process to manage changes during this stage as well. And then during this stage, during the build stage, what are some of the best practices? To arrest timeline, you all have heard about long lead equipment, but it's better to define long lead component inside the long lead equipment so that you still arrest the overall timeline, but don't have to freeze the entire design. So again, take a MAB example, MAB facility example. Bioreactor is a long lead package, no question about it. Needs to be defined early on, engage vendors, hopefully release orders so that you arrest the timeline. But how do you do that when the rest of the design is still under process? So the way to do it is, yes, you define the requirements early, but within the bioreactor package, you define the long lead components. Focus on that, the vessel itself, maybe the temperature control elements inside, maybe some of the filters, but not the piping within the bioreactor, not some of the common valves within the bioreactor. What I'm saying is, we'll still keep that option open to manage changes as the design is being further developed. And you'll have to work it out through your vendor, through change management process. So for example, you release the order for a large bioreactor, but you're still going through the design of how you'll integrate your media system with the bioreactor. So how the media is flowed through different options, how the different feeds are fed to bioreactor, how the CIPs flows if it's a large reactor. Things are still under development. So invariably, the bioreactor package won't be 100% frozen, which is fine. You can still add valves, remove valves. That's where defined procedures, even commercially, have to make those change managements so that it doesn't give heartburn to your project managers, basically. Cost control and all of that. And then this slide is more from CQV through Ops again. So this is the more subsequent part where if things are not done right, then the maintenance SOPs, operational SOPs may not have the rigor and detail in it. Reliability engineering may suffer. So again, clear roles and responsibility map. This is more in the CQMP perspective, so that your SOPs eventually are fully developed. You can still have changes, but more or less these changes will be under the purview of QCC, so-called quality change control at this point. I want to summarize. So, impact of change management in our world, right? It touches upon the big four corners: efficiency, compliance, cost, and contemporization. I touched upon some of these. And then I want to leave with a new buzzword, critical thinking. Again, I don't know how many of you have read or seen this Camp 5 guide. Great addition to ISPE library. If you don't have that, highly recommend that you invest in one. But you will see in it something new, an entire appendix devoted to critical thinking, right? I mean, you would think critical thinking, right? I mean, sounds like a philosophy topic. Why is it in an ISP guidance document? But once you read through it, you'll realize how important this is, right? So for example, it appears in a new GAM5, but I put my own definition here. In a more complete sense, it is a basic domain expertise, right? Needed in the entire lifecycle management. And it's not just in GAMP or not just C&Q. Ultimately, this is where experience and expertise matter, right? And there are no shortcuts. Unfortunately, you'll never have a textbook on critical thinking because you can't have, like any other domain. But it's important enough that ISP has devoted an entire appendix to it. And critical thinking, when she threw all of this, right? I mean, it's basically understanding the business. I generally don't like to use the word holistic, but still there it is in a more holistic sense. Understanding the business from very basic product and process, core, quality, regulatory, health, safety, environment. Then the third level is operations, efficiency, automation, user preferences, company procedures. Of course, last but not the least, you absolutely need to understand the business case, return on investment, cash flows during the project, your cost, feature expandability, and all of that. So, I mean, a lot of these elements go into so-called critical thinking to apply proper change management through the more upstream parts of the life cycle. So I think I'll stop here. I said many things, and I'll be very happy to hear some feedback, comments. How do we do this, Christina?
Yeah, thanks, Sanjay. Thanks for the presentation and on the topic. I hope the participants would have some queries. If you guys have some queries, please put it in chat box. In next 5 minutes, we might be able to answer some of them if there are any.
Yes, thank you, Sanjay. So like I was saying, this is a good opportunity for everyone to pick the brain of the expert. So take this chance to ask your questions. On another note, so we have recorded this session, and we will share this on our YouTube channel, and we will follow up also with Sanjay's contact information, so you will be able to get in touch with Sanjay directly. So maybe we wait for another minute or so, if anyone would like to place a question here, or you may also just unmute yourself and just go ahead. Otherwise, we can just call it a day and let Sanjay off early into his evening. Okay, so we have one question. Sanjay, over to you, yeah?
Yeah. Sanjay, there's a query. You mentioned premature QCC. Would you advocate PCC, a project change control, prior to QCC?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just trying to bring up my screen here, and I apologize. Pardon me, I'm not very familiar with Zoom because we use Microsoft Teams, so pardon me here. I'm trying to pull out my... Yeah, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, so I guess the question is more on project change PCC versus QCC, something here, right?
Yes. So you mentioned premature QCC. So would you advocate PCC, that is project change control, prior to quality change control? Is a query.
Yeah, absolutely. The short answer is yes. Now, there are again some definitions of PCC, right? Some people call it EC and engineering change management. So, for example, this is what ISP baseline guide talks about. And again, there's also some debate on whether it starts here, starts even before. But definitely, yes, by all means, you should have a project change control procedure. debate that. Again, one pointer I'll give you is, if you're reviewing the PCC, talk to people who have executed project from end to end and see where things went a little crazy, haywire during project execution, and where you want to probably revise the PCC itself, make it very relevant, make it crisp, not too onerous. At the same time, don't make it too loose that it just again becomes just another bureaucracy and people don't really document that yet. So yeah, definitely PCC should cover many of those elements, make it efficient, simple, easy to understand and follow. And at the end of the day, if it's done properly, it gives you tremendous benefits from every perspective and project and then subsequent life cycle of the facility.
Thanks, Sanjay. Thanks for the insight. I do not see any more queries coming up, and if you guys have any queries, you can mail it to us. We would be more than happy to answer it through Sanjay. So I think we can wrap up the session for today. Thanks a lot for joining in, and thanks Sanjay and Christina for this your session. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Thank you all. Yeah, thank you all for your time. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.